Dr. Kniss is in the Department of Plant Sciences and is a weed scientist, and is doing a lot of work not only here at the Laramie R&E Center but some of the other R&E centers as well. And so I'll introduce Dr. Andrew Canis and let him take it from there.
All right, thanks, Doug. So most of my work is out in the field at our R&E centers in Powell and Lingle. But I do some things here because I like to feel like a horticulturist every now and then. So I do grow plants in buckets, or I have my students grow plants in buckets. These are all Albert's. I'll introduce him later. But to introduce the concept I'm going to talk about, it's a little bit different than I think a lot of what we think about weed science, where you see weeds, you go kill them. We're doing some more fun work related to weeds and crops and how they interact. So we just had an eclipse. You guys all looked at the sun, hopefully with your protective glasses. Yeah. How many of you were in the path of totality during that? That was really cool, wasn't it? So anyone here from Glendo? No, you're not one of the 18 people who actually live in Glendo. So the people in Glendo got pretty overwhelmed with lots of people coming into the state, right? There were 20,000, 30,000 people at Glendo Lake. I saw pictures of the beach, and they were just you couldn't walk out of the tent without hitting another tent. It was amazing. And so if you're one of the residents of Glendo, and you know that you're going to get inundated with 30,000 people, what are you going to do? What do you suppose the residents of Glendo did before all those people came into town? They got all the stuff but they needed before all the people showed up, right? So they went to the local grocery store and bait shop and bought their 2 gallons of milk and made sure they had their cars fueled up, and so because they knew that pretty soon there was going to be a lot of competition for those items that you need to survive, right? So they got their bottled water, they got their milk, they got their fuel. Plants do the same thing. So plants actually can tell before they're in an extremely competitive environment that they're about to be in a very competitive environment. And it's a really cool concept called shade avoidance. So they do this through a variety of mechanisms, but the most well known is reflected light. So if you have a plant growing here and a plant growing here, those plants know they're next to other plants. And what they do is they try to grow differently in order to avoid being shaded by their neighbors. So I'm going to introduce Albert Adjesiwor. He's one of our PhD students in the Department of Plant Sciences, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about that concept and how it applies to some of the work he's doing in sugar beet.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So as I was saying, that if you sense that other plants are growing around you, probably the best thing to do is to try to grow as fast as you can or tall as you can so that you get more light than your neighbors. And so by doing that, it means that you are diverting more resources into your stem, try to grow taller than your neighbors. It means that you have more resources, less resources left for, say, seed production. And so this concept, though even if there is competition has not set in yet, it can reduce yield. And so we are dealing with sugar beet. All of us know that most of us here know that sugar beets don't grow that tall. This is just about how tall they grow in the first season. And so if sugar beet sense that other plants are growing around them, we don't quite know how they will respond. Because for corn, one would expect that they will try to grow tall to be able to outcompete their neighbors. But for sugar beets, we don't quite know how they will do that because they don't grow tall. So they are poor competitors for light. And so what we're trying to do is that trying to isolate this shade avoidance concept by trying to just get the reflected light without any resource competition to know how the sugar beet will respond. And most of the time we think that if plants are not competing, if the neighbors are not competing for resources, there's no yield loss. But that's not quite true, because if you divert more resources into trying to grow tall, you produce less seeds. And so our research setup, we have this plastic layer here, and so we can remove this grass here, and then you can see that the root of the grass doesn't enter the bucket, so there is no resource competition. And what we've seen is that just by the grass around the plant reflecting the alpha red light, instead of the plants growing like kind of horizontal leaves, they try to grow their leaves more vertical. And they also try to produce longer petioles, which kind of makes sense because that will make your leaves, like project your leaves higher above your neighbors so that you can get more sunlight. And by doing that, they produce fewer leaves, which in turn reduce the yield of sugar beet. We saw up to 23% yield reduction last year just by letting the grass sit by the plant without competing for any water or nutrients. The grass and then the beet have different drip lines running through, and so there is no limitation for water or nutrients. We've added fertilizer to the bucket, to the beet, and then the grass, the root of the grass, as I said, didn't enter the bucket. And so what we're trying to do is that if this response is initiated and I go around and take out the weed, will the plant be able to recover the yield loss due to the presence of the weed? So we're trying to look at the timing, the critical timing after which when you remove the grass, you'll be able to recover any yield loss incurred due to the presence of the grass. And so with that, I'll take any questions you have about the beets in the buckets. Yes.
So in that bucket that you just took the grass out of, there's the grass, but in the other one there's no grass?
There's no grass.
So, and then you said that they're not actually competing.
Yes.
So how does the beet know that the grass is there?
Yep, so thank you. So as Dr. Kniss said at the beginning, just so the sunlight has like red and far red light in it. And the plants absorb most of that red light and reflect back the far red light. So the normal sunlight we are seeing now, the ratio of red to far red light will be around 1:1 ratio. And so because the plants are reflecting more far red light to the beet, the ratio of red to far red light change in the beet environment. That's how we know that other plants are growing around it. And so we try to initiate responses that, okay, if I sense that other plants are growing around me, I have to grow as tall as I can, which is what the beet is trying to do to be able to avoid that competition. That's what reduces the yield of the beets eventually.
Oh,
Did I answer your question?
yeah. How did you know that though? How did you figure that out?
Yeah, and so so this concept have been tested in the lab just by using like artificial far red light. And so if you don't use even a normal plant and you use an artificial far red light, you see the same response in the lab. And that's how come we are able to tell that it's far red light that is causing the difference in growth and yield that we see in the field due to the presence of weeds.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great explanation.
Hi, Amy.
So you were measuring, can it recover? But you didn't say the answer.
Yes, just because we've been doing this for about the past 3 years, and we haven't really gotten to be able to analyze all the data yet and see like what is the critical period after which when we remove them they can recover. And so maybe by the end of this year, this is probably my final year of this research, and so by the end of this year I should be able to have an answer to that as to what is the best time after which when you remove the weeds they'll be able to recover.
But there is some recovery but you think there is some recovery.
Yes.
But you're just not sure of the timing.
Yes. What I've seen is that so we remove the weeds at different times. Like when you have 2 leaves, we remove the weeds, and there are some treatment that we add the leaf. Like we add the weeds from 2 true leaves. What we've seen is that we see this wider angle from the soil surface, but once we remove the weeds, with time they begin to look more like this, and so there's some kind of recovery in terms of the morphology, but I can't really quite tell now whether they are able to recover any yield loss due to that response they've initiated early in the season. Yes. Like common lamb squatters and some kochias and some other weeds. But we are using the grass because we want something that when we cut it to be able to come back, because we don't want direct shading. And so you see me all around here most of the time using scissors to cut down this grass from all those buckets you see out there to make sure that they are not shading the beet, so there is no direct competition for sunlight.
Does the sugar beet know it's next to a grass versus next to a different kind of weed?
It doesn't. And so we get asked all the time that, okay, so in the field, we don't grow sugar beet by themselves, like just one sugar beet in the bucket or in the field. We grow sugar beet at high densities, and so if the sugar beet is growing here as sugar beet, would the sugar beet be able to tell, is it my colleague's sugar beet that's growing or is a weed? And so we had a study that we just harvested, trying to tell whether if we grow sugar beet around sugar beet and sugar beet around the grass or the common lamb squatter that we commonly see in the field, whether the sugar beet will be able to tell the difference. And you can't quite do that. So it doesn't really know the difference, which makes sense because it's just using the reflected light. Because both green plants reflect far red light, it's not able to tell the difference between the far red light reflected from beets from that of other plant species. So the question was about what about sugar content? We've not really analyzed for sucrose, but we track the carbohydrate content of the root and the leaves throughout the season. And what we saw was that early in the season, we see that differences in carbohydrate or sugars. But at a later season, like late in the season, those differences kind of close up because I think they kind of remobilize all the sugars from the leaves back to the root. And so we don't really see much difference at the end of the season. So they mostly plant in April and harvest somewhere in October. September, October. But here so those rings are just about like 3 inches or 4 inches. And so when the sugar beets grow to some stage, they begin to outgrow the ring and crack the ring open and the water doesn't enter the bucket anymore. And so you have to harvest them early to make sure that that is not confounding our results. And so we don't quite take them to the full season just because we have limitation on how big we can get the sugar beet to grow in the buckets. Thank you.
All right, so there's actually a lot of research done, beyond us. So we're interested in sugar beets, like Albert said, because we had no idea what a sugar beet would do because it can't grow very tall. So the different angles was interesting, but there's actually some really interesting research out of Canada showing how corn and soybean respond to this type of environment. And one of the biggest things they do is they grow tall, and as a trade-off, they have to produce fewer seeds because they invested all of those resources in growing tall. They also reduce their root growth because they're trying to grow tall, and the lack of roots then has that trade-off where they produce fewer seeds. So if you're a corn or a soybean grower, that's a really important thing, right? If you're producing fewer seeds, that's a pretty big deal. Sugar beet growers don't care about seeds, at least not the ones in Wyoming. Up in the Willamette Valley where they produce sugar beets for seed production, that's a big deal. But for our growers, it's not. So that was one of the reasons we were interested in this. But another crop we grow a lot of in Wyoming is dry edible beans. So pinto beans, great northern beans. We have a lot of acres of that up in the Bighorn Basin and down in southeast Wyoming and in Platte and Goshen County. And one of the questions we were interested there is are the responses similar in dry edible bean as they are in soybean? We expected they would be. But another thing that we were interested in, and for those interested, I won't make you walk down there right now, but we can walk down there later and I can show you the plots where we're doing this and show the experimental setup. It's similar but a little bit different. One of the things we do to harvest dry edible beans, which is very different from soybeans, is in soybeans they basically run the combine through and they cut the soybeans right out of the field, throw them in the combine, into the truck, and off to the elevator. Well, with dry beans we don't do that. At least most of our growers don't do that, because one of the biggest differences between soybeans and dry beans is soybeans hold their pods with the seeds quite a ways off the ground. So 6-8 inches usually between the ground and the lowest soybean pod. Dry edible beans don't do that. Dry edible beans hold their pods very close to the soil because they don't grow as tall to begin with, but also the physiology of the dry edible bean plant keeps those pods close to the soil. So some of the dry bean pods actually at harvest time may actually be even touching the soil or maybe less than an inch off of the soil surface. So one of the things we have to do for dry edible bean harvest in Wyoming is we usually undercut the dry beans, basically uproot the bean plants, put them in a windrow, let them dry down there, and then we pick the windrows up at harvest time after they've dried down. That allows the growers to get as many beans as possible into the tank. Because if we just run a cutter bar on that soil surface, they would basically clip a lot of those bean pods, and you'd have a lot of beans hitting the surface. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of directly harvested dry beans in Wyoming. So one of the things that we've been doing, and again, I'm happy to walk you through those plots. They're over there, kind of over by those little high tunnels over there. We've actually been trying to see if we can use some of these shade avoidance responses as a beneficial thing. So here we're looking at how much of the detrimental effect is this having on sugar beets by allowing weeds to grow in the field. But with dry edible beans, we're actually seeing, okay, well, if we were to grow dry edible beans with, say, a winter wheat cover crop, so we plant the beans into this green environment, will that cause those beans to grow taller, have them set their pods a little bit higher, and allow growers to save a couple trips through the field, reduce their soil erosion by not having to undercup, and actually just run the combine directly through the field and not lose as many beans? And what we've shown is that, yeah, that actually works pretty well. We reduced harvest losses from direct cutting. We're working with one of our cooperator growers over by Pine Bluffs, Burns area, Ty and Tim Anderson. We actually reduced harvest losses from 30% down to 4% when we did that by growing it to the winter wheat. Unfortunately, we also reduced yield by 70%. So it was a really, really bad trade-off. So he got way higher percentage of the beans in the combine, but we really reduced the number of beans they produced. So what we're trying to do now is actually try to figure out, are there varieties of beans that naturally hold their pods a little bit higher, and can we find a timing again, so similar to what we're looking at in sugar beet, can we find a timing when we can remove that grass, spray it out with a herbicide or till out that grass, to basically we get the increased growth of the dry beans early in the season, but then remove the weedy environment before we actually observe the yield loss. And so that's what we're doing. So what we're doing here in Laramie is actually looking at the interaction between the grass response in dry beans and the varieties. So do varieties that naturally grow tall, do they also have that same response where the grass makes them grow taller, or is that just something that the shorter statured varieties do? So we can show you kind of how we've got that set up over there, but that's another thing we're doing for the dry edible bean growers. Basically the same concept is here, but we're trying to actually use this instead of making a case that we need to control the weeds that we're doing in sugar beets. We're actually trying to see if we can use that response for a beneficial purpose in the dry edible bean crop. So that's all I've got to say. That's some of the fun stuff we're doing in weed science and weed ecology right now. We can walk over there later. I'm happy to show you the setup, but if you have questions, happy to answer them or try and answer them. And if not, that is fine too.